Case number 1. Michael Benn. On the afternoon of July 19th, 1997, someone requested a welfare check on Robert Rose. The coin dealer had not been heard from since an afternoon appointment at his shop in South River, New Jersey. When colleagues arrived, they found him dead inside. He had been shot in the head and in the chest. Approximately $40,000 in rare coins was gone. The appointment had been scheduled in advance. Whoever killed Robert Rose had planned to do it. Michael Benn was 43 years old at the time and had spent his professional life in the world of money. He had worked as a licensed securities broker before transitioning into coin dealing, a field built on trust, expertise, and the private exchange of high-value assets between known parties. By 1997, he was drowning in debt. The financial pressures had become severe, and whatever respectable standing he had maintained through years of professional work was quietly being dismantled by obligations he could not meet. He had no prior violent criminal history. He was married, college-educated, and regarded as a struggling but legitimate professional. The firearm he carried into Rose's shop on July 19th was not something his colleagues knew about. Robert Rose was 57 years old and had built his business in South River over years of careful work. He operated alone, which was common in the trade, a one-man shop containing inventory that was compact, valuable, and easily moved. He was married and well-regarded in the community of South River, a local businessman whose name people knew and trusted. He was, by most accounts, nearing the later stage of a career he had built from the ground up. He had no reason to suspect that the man he had agreed to meet that afternoon had come to kill him. Benn arrived for the appointment. At some point during the meeting, he shot Robert Rose in the head and in the chest. He took the coins, approximately $40,000 worth, rare inventory that had identifying characteristics within the collector trade, and left the shop. He then attempted to move the merchandise, approaching coin dealers in other locations to fence what he had stolen. The motive was financial. The premeditation was clear. He had scheduled the meeting, armed himself, and executed the plan in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The investigation moved quickly once detectives began tracing the missing inventory. Rare coins are not anonymous. Dealers know their stock, and the pieces missing from Rose's shop were specific enough that when Benn attempted to sell them to other dealers, those dealers recognized what they were being offered. Several testified that Benn had sold or attempted to sell them the exact coins reported missing from Rose's inventory. Investigators also found a box of lead bullets at Benn's home. The Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office referred the bullet evidence to the FBI, which applied Comparative Bullet Lead Analysis, a technique by which agents compared the chemical composition of bullet fragments from the crime scene against the unspent ammunition in Benn's possession. The FBI concluded the lead was analytically indistinguishable, meaning both bullets originated, in the agency's assessment, from the same source. Benn was arrested in late summer 1997, charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery. He pleaded not guilty. No murder weapon was ever recovered. The case went to a Middlesex County Superior Court jury in 1998. The prosecution presented a straightforward argument. Benn was financially desperate. He had scheduled a private meeting with a coin dealer. He had sold the missing coins afterward, and the FBI's science proved that the bullets in his home matched the lead at the crime scene. The defense countered that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. No weapon, no witness to the shooting, and the possibility that someone else had killed Rose before Benn arrived to steal the coins. The FBI's CBLA testimony was the case's physical anchor. Benn did not testify. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder and armed robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison with a 30-year parole disqualifier. That sentence stood until 2004, when the National Academy of Sciences published a comprehensive review of forensic bullet lead analysis. The report concluded that the scientific premises underlying CBLA were fundamentally flawed, that chemical similarities between bullets did not reliably indicate a common source, and that the technique's core claims could not be scientifically validated. In 2005, the New Jersey Appellate Division ruled in State v. Bain that CBLA evidence was inherently unreliable and vacated the conviction. Facing a retrial in which the bullet evidence would be inadmissible, Bain pleaded guilty in 2007 to a lesser charge related to the stolen property and was released for time served. He had been incarcerated for 9 years. He was in his early 50s. He has lived privately since. State v. Bean became a landmark ruling in the dismantling of CBLA nationally, establishing a legal standard for how newly discredited forensic science could be applied to existing convictions. The case illustrated something the NAS report had stated plainly, that for years, juries had been convicting people based on a technique the FBI presented as ironclad and that had no reliable scientific foundation. Robert Rose was still dead. The coins were gone, and the only physical evidence that had ever placed Michael Bain at the murder, the chemical analysis of bullets he never fired, turned out to be science that should never have been admitted at all. Case number 2, Jimmy Yates. In 1991, in a remote area outside Baker, Florida, a vehicle was found burning. When fire crews reached the scene, they discovered a body inside. The victim was Norma Jean Yates, and she had been shot multiple times before the fire was set. The vehicle fire had been staged. Someone had wanted investigators to believe they were looking at an accident. They were not. Jimmy Yates was a local laborer in his early 40s, a working-class man who had lived in Baker his entire life in Okaloosa County. He had no history of serious violence. He was known to his neighbors as a regular figure in a small town where regular figures were familiar and unremarkable. The marriage to Norma Jean had its tensions. The prosecution would later argue those tensions formed the motive for what followed. But nothing in Yates's background before 1991 had marked him as a man capable of what he was accused of. When investigators arrived at the burned vehicle, the same statistical logic that guides early homicide investigation brought them to his door. When a wife is killed, the husband is the first question. Norma Jean Yates was a woman known to her neighbors in the small, close-knit community of Baker in Okaloosa County. She was married, embedded in the life of a town where people recognized each other, and her death sent a particular kind of shock through a place too small to absorb it quietly. The staging of the fire, the attempt to make her death look like something other than what it was, speaks to the particular cruelty of what was done to her. She was shot before she was placed in her own car. She was driven to a remote location. The fire was set. The intention was that she would be found and counted as a tragedy without a perpetrator. That part of the plan did not hold. Fire investigators determined quickly that the blaze had been deliberately set. Bullet fragments were recovered from the burned wreckage, evidence that survived the fire and complicated the accident theory significantly. Investigators found a box of ammunition at Jimmy Yates's home. The FBI applied comparative bullet lead analysis to the fragments recovered from the scene and to the rounds from Yates's ammunition box. The agency concluded that the lead was analytically consistent, that the bullets that killed Norma Jean and the bullets in her husband's possession shared the same chemical composition and likely originated from the same manufactured source. That conclusion became the spine of the prosecution's case. Yates was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. The trial did not come until 1998, 7 years after Norma Jean's death. The prosecution rested heavily on the FBI's bullet lead testimony. presenting the chemical analysis as definitive physical proof that the ammunition in Eitz's home was the same ammunition used to kill his wife. The defense challenged the circumstantial nature of the evidence. No murder weapon had been recovered, and the only direct physical link was the FBI's analysis of burned fragments. The jury convicted Eitz of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He spent the next decade incarcerated, maintaining his innocence. After the 2004 National Academy of Sciences report systematically dismantled the scientific validity of comparative bullet lead analysis, the Innocence Project of Florida took his case. The NAS report had found that the chemical similarities the FBI had been testifying to for decades did not reliably establish that two bullets came from the same source, that the entire analytical framework was unsound. The Innocence Project presented this finding to the courts. In December 2008, after serving approximately 10 years, Eitz was released. Prosecutors declined to retry him without the bullet evidence. Among the more striking elements of the case's aftermath was the conduct of the prosecutor who had helped obtain the original conviction. Once he understood the extent to which the FBI's science had been discredited, he did not resist the effort to undo what his office had done. He joined the defense's request to have the conviction overturned. It was an unusual act of institutional honesty. A man who had put Jimmy Eitz in prison, acknowledging that the foundation of that conviction had never been sound. The case contributed to a statewide audit in Florida of all prior convictions that had relied on FBI laboratory testimony. Eitz was in his late 70s by the time that process concluded. He had been a free man for years. But the years he lost were not returned to him, and the system that had taken them had operated for a long time, with complete confidence in a technique that had been wrong all along. Case number 3, Lee Wayne Hunt. Lee Wayne Hunt has been in a North Carolina prison for more than 40 years. The star witness against him admitted he lied. The scientific evidence used to convict him has been formally debunked. Another man signed a sworn affidavit confessing to the murders for which Hunt was convicted. North Carolina courts have reviewed all of this and decided, repeatedly, that none of it is sufficient to grant him a new trial. His case is still moving through the legal system. He has not been released. In 1984, Hunt was 25 years old and known in Fayetteville, North Carolina, as someone involved in the local drug trade. That background shaped how investigators saw him when Roland and Lisa Matthews were found shot to death in Fayetteville in March of that year. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Hunt and an accomplice had killed the couple over a dispute involving drug debts or territory. It was a plausible narrative. The problem was proving it. Roland and Lisa Matthews were adults living in Fayetteville, moving in the same illegal economy as the man accused of killing them. Their deaths, 2 people shot in a city where drug-related violence was not uncommon, required physical evidence to connect a specific perpetrator. The investigation produced bullets recovered from the scene. The FBI applied comparative bullet lead analysis, comparing the recovered rounds to ammunition linked to Hunt. Agents testified the recovered rounds and Hunt's ammunition were, in the Bureau's language, a match at the elemental level. Lead that had originated from the same source. A jailhouse informant and co-defendant corroborated the theory, claiming Hunt had been involved. Together, the informant's account and the FBI's science. The prosecution had what it needed. Hunt was tried in 1985. The FBI's testimony characterized the bullet lead as an elemental match. The informant placed Hunt at the scene. The defense had no credible scientific basis to challenge the FBI's methods. At the time, CBLA was accepted by courts as reliable forensic analysis. The jury convicted Hunt of double homicide. He was sentenced to life in prison. What followed over the next 4 decades dismantled the case against him, piece by piece. The informant later admitted he had lied on the stand. A separate man came forward, signed an affidavit confessing to the murders of Roland and Lisa Matthews, and stated explicitly that Lee Wayne Hunt had not been present. Then, in 2004, a report from the National Academy of Sciences reached a conclusion the FBI had resisted for years. The technique was invalid. That the chemical comparisons agents had been presenting as forensic certainty could not support the claims being made from them. Every element that had produced the conviction had collapsed. North Carolina courts responded to each of these developments by invoking the harmless error doctrine, a legal standard under which an appellate court can acknowledge that a piece of evidence was false or improperly admitted while still upholding a conviction if it determines the outcome would have been the same without it. The courts admitted the forensic evidence was junk. They admitted the informant had perjured himself. They acknowledged the alternate confession existed. They ruled, each time, that the remaining evidence was sufficient to sustain the verdict. Hunt remained in prison. He continues to file appeals. As of the 2020s, he is held by the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction. He is in his late 60s. The harmless error doctrine exists for practical reasons. Courts cannot relitigate every case in which one piece of evidence turns out to be flawed. But the Hunt case has forced a direct confrontation with the doctrine's limits. When the scientific evidence is junk, the star witness has confessed to perjury, and another man has confessed to the crime. At what point does harmless become a word that means something different from what it says? That question does not have a judicial answer yet. Lee Wayne Hunt is still waiting for one. Case number 4, William C. Fisher. At William Fisher's trial in the early 1990s, an FBI agent took the stand and testified with scientific precision that the lead recovered from the body of James Catterall and the lead found in a bullet box at Fisher's home had originated from the same batch of molten metal. He gave this testimony with authority. He presented it as the product of rigorous forensic analysis. The database he would have needed to support that conclusion did not exist. No centralized record of lead manufacturing batches had ever been compiled. The probabilities he offered the jury were numbers drawn from nowhere. William Fisher lived in Pennsylvania and knew James Catterall. The two were acquaintances, described in the case record as sharing a living arrangement, connected by proximity rather than close friendship. In 1989, Catterall was shot. A personal dispute was identified as the motive. The weapon was never found. What investigators found at Fisher's home was a box of ammunition. The absence of the weapon made the contents of that box critical. Without a firearm to trace, without ballistic matching in the traditional sense, the prosecution needed another way to connect Fisher's household to the bullet in Catterall's body. The FBI provided that connection through Comparative Bullet Lead Analysis. James Catterall was an adult living in Pennsylvania when he was shot in 1989. He and Fisher shared a living arrangement, which gave the prosecution its narrative of proximity and access. The details of Catterall's life beyond that relationship are not extensively documented in the public record. What is documented is that he was killed, that a jury was asked to decide who was responsible, and that the answer the jury received was shaped by testimony that had no legitimate scientific foundation. The CBLA technique worked as follows. FBI analysts would extract small samples of lead from a crime scene bullet and from comparison rounds, then measure the concentrations of trace elements, antimony, arsenic, copper, bismuth, and compare the profiles. If the profiles were similar, agents testified that the bullets likely came from the same manufactured batch. At Fisher's trial, the agent went further, implying the bullets traced to identical molten lead. The jury heard this as a scientific determination. It was not. The FBI had no database of lead manufacturing records to consult. The statistical claims were constructed without any underlying data to support them. The jury convicted Fisher of first-degree murder. He received a life sentence. The 2004 NAS report landed with particular force in Pennsylvania. Its conclusion, that bullet lead analysis had no valid scientific foundation, was exactly what Fisher's appellate team had needed. In 2005, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled in Commonwealth versus Fisher that FBI bullet lead testimony was inherently unreliable and granted a new trial, one of the earliest and most aggressive applications of the NAS findings by any state Supreme Court. The ruling exposed something that the trial jury had never been told. FBI analysts had been testifying for years to statistical probabilities derived from a database that did not exist, presenting manufactured precision as established science. Fisher's conviction was vacated. What followed was a prolonged legal process. The final resolution of his case is not fully reflected in the public record. Commonwealth versus Fisher became a significant precedent, helping establish the standard by which courts in Pennsylvania and beyond would evaluate post-conviction challenges based on discredited forensic science. It contributed to a broader reckoning with decades of FBI laboratory testimony across multiple forensic disciplines. The agent who had testified at Fisher's trial had not been guessing idly. He had been deploying a methodology his agency vouched for in a courtroom that trusted the FBI's authority, against a defendant who had no scientific basis to challenge what he was hearing. The problem was not one rogue analyst. The technique itself was the problem, and for years, courts had accepted it without question. Case number 5. Wayne Washington. Before his son was murdered, Marshall Morgan Sr. had taken out a life insurance policy worth $100,000 on him. In May 1993, Marshall Morgan Jr. was shot and killed in Chicago. He was 20 years old and a college athlete at the Illinois Institute of Technology. His father collected the insurance money. A 19-year-old named Wayne Washington was arrested, beaten by detectives until he signed a confession, and sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder. Morgan Sr. eventually went to prison for killing someone else the same way. Washington was exonerated in 2015 after serving 22 years. Washington was 19 at the time, young enough that the threat of the death penalty carried an entirely different weight. He had been targeted by detectives operating under the command of John Burge, who had run a unit within the Chicago Police Department that systematically tortured suspects, primarily young black men, into providing false confessions. The Burge era produced dozens of wrongful convictions over more than 2 decades. Washington was one of them. He had no documented connection to the killing of Marshall Morgan Jr. What he had was the misfortune of being identifiable as a suspect in a city where certain detectives had refined coercion into standard practice. He was brought in, beaten, and presented with a choice: sign the confession or face the death penalty at trial. He signed. Marshall Morgan Jr. was 20 years old and attending the Illinois Institute of Technology on an athletic scholarship when he was shot in a vehicle in Chicago in May of 1993. He was building something. His father had calculated what that something was worth and decided it was worth more as a payout than as a life. The life insurance policy had been taken out before the killing. The motive was $100,000. The mechanism was murder. And when investigators needed someone to charge, a teenager in a Burge-era interrogation room was made to confess to a crime arranged by the victim's own father. The FBI provided additional support for the prosecution through Comparative Bullet Lead Analysis, which was applied to falsely link Washington to the bullets used in the shooting. The coerced confession gave the prosecution its narrative. The FBI's bullet science gave it a physical anchor. The death penalty was presented to Washington as the alternative to a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. There was no jury trial. There was no moment at which the evidence was tested in open court. He entered the Illinois prison system at 19 and remained there as evidence slowly began to point elsewhere. The evidence that pointed elsewhere led directly to Morgan Sr. After Washington's conviction, investigators and post-conviction advocates began tracing the circumstances of the killing more carefully. The life insurance policy surfaced. Morgan Sr.'s financial situation and the timing of the policy were examined. Then Morgan Sr. was convicted of murdering another person. Using the same method, the same scheme, the same logic of financial gain through death. That conviction made the pattern undeniable. The state had charged the wrong man. The right man had been free for 22 years, during which time he killed again. Washington was exonerated in 2015. He received a certificate of innocence. He had entered prison as a teenager and emerged in middle age. His case became one of the documented examples used in the continuing legal and political effort to address the Burge era, a systematic accounting of what the Chicago Police Department had done to hundreds of people across more than 2 decades. The FBI's bullet science in Washington's case had not been the primary engine of the wrongful conviction. The coerced confession was. But CBLA had been deployed to reinforce a lie, lending forensic authority to a document that had been extracted through violence. The science and the coercion worked in the same direction. They put the same innocent man in prison. Case number 6. Ronald Mikos Joyce. Brannon had worked for Ronald Mikos for years. She had been a nurse before she became his secretary, and in that role, she had seen the inside of his medical practice in enough detail to become useful to federal investigators building a case against him. By 2002, Mikos was under active investigation for a multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud scheme, billing the federal government for procedures that had never been performed, extracting money from a system designed to provide medical care. Brannon had agreed to cooperate. She was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury within days. She was found shot multiple times in the back of the head. Ronald Mikos was a podiatrist who had built a practice and then used it as a vehicle for large-scale financial fraud. The Medicare scheme was substantial, the kind of case that ends careers, ends freedom, and generates the sort of federal attention that does not go away. Mikos understood what Brannon's testimony could do. She had been inside his operation. She could speak to what she had witnessed. He had already committed one federal crime. He was willing to commit another to prevent the first from reaching a jury. He killed his secretary to avoid a federal fraud conviction, and in doing so, guaranteed a far worse outcome than the one he had been trying to escape. Joyce Brannon had made a decision. She had agreed to participate in the federal process, to tell investigators what she knew about the practice she had worked in, to let the legal system function as it was designed to function. She was days away from doing that. The specific nature of her cooperation, what she knew, how long she had known it, what records she could corroborate, made her valuable to the prosecution and dangerous to Mikos. She was killed because she had chosen to tell the truth. After Brannon's death, federal investigators had little distance to travel. The proximity of the killing to her scheduled grand jury testimony made the motive obvious. From Mikos's storage unit, investigators established that a .22 caliber revolver was missing. An ammunition box in the same unit was examined. Exactly 20 rounds were gone. The FBI applied comparative bullet lead analysis to the bullets recovered from Brannon's body and to the remaining ammunition in Mikos's storage unit. The agency concluded the lead was analytically consistent. The missing revolver, the missing rounds, the CBLA results, and the overwhelming clarity of motive produced a federal capital charge, murder of a witness scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury. The government sought the death penalty. The federal trial rested on the convergence of circumstantial elements. Mikos had motive, means, and opportunity. His storage unit had contained the likely weapon and the matching ammunition. The timing of the killing was precise. CBLA was one of the last major federal trials to employ the technique before its collapse, following the 2004 NAS report. Mikos was convicted. He was sentenced to death. He appealed on the grounds that the bullet lead analysis had been discredited. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the challenge and upheld the death sentence. The court's reasoning was specific, even setting the CBLA evidence aside entirely. The circumstantial case, the missing weapon, the missing rounds, the proximity to the testimony date, the established motive, was independently sufficient to sustain the conviction. The junk science had been used, but its removal did not change the outcome. Mikos remains on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. His case occupies an unusual position in the larger history of CBLA. Every other case in this series involves the technique being used against someone who was innocent or against someone whose conviction could not survive the removal of the fabricated evidence. Mikos is the exception. A man the evidence correctly identified, convicted on real motive and real circumstantial proof, who attempted to use the collapse of a forensic technique as an escape from accountability. The Seventh Circuit did not allow it. He is the rare instance in which junk science pointed at the right person. That coincidence did not rehabilitate the science. It simply meant that, in this one case, the system's error did not produce an injustice. What it produced was a death sentence that could have been built without the error in the first place. Case number 7, John Huffington. When John Huffington's defense team requested DNA testing on the biological evidence from his 1981 murder conviction, the state of Maryland moved to have that evidence legally destroyed before the test could be conducted. The motion failed. The DNA was tested. It did not match Huffington. He had been on death row. He had served more than 40 years. He was exonerated in 2023 and granted a full pardon. He is currently suing the county for $100 million. What the state had tried to prevent, the truth, turned out to be exactly what the evidence contained. John Huffington was 18 years old in 1981 when Joseph and Diane Hudson were found shot to death in Maryland. The two were adults known to Huffington through the local drug scene, and the prosecution's theory was that a drug-related robbery or dispute had turned fatal. Huffington denied involvement. An acquaintance, looking to secure a deal for himself, placed Huffington at the scene. That testimony, combined with what the prosecution presented as two independent streams of scientific evidence from the FBI, was sufficient. The jury convicted him on both counts. Joseph and Diane Hudson were killed in their community in 1981. They were adults with lives embedded in the neighborhood around them. Their deaths were real losses, whatever the circumstances that surrounded them, and whatever use was later made of those deaths by investigators and prosecutors who built a case against the wrong man. The FBI's forensic case against Huffington was built on two separate techniques deployed in combination, and the simultaneity of that double endorsement made the evidence feel irrefutable. The first technique was microscopic hair comparison analysis, through which an FBI agent testified that hair recovered from the crime scene was a 99.9% match to John Huffington, a claim that communicated near certainty to the jury. The second technique was comparative bullet lead analysis, through which agents testified that bullets found at the scene were analytically indistinguishable from ammunition linked to Huffington. Two branches of FBI forensic science presented as independent confirmations, both pointing to the same man. The defense had no scientific basis to challenge either. Both techniques were accepted by courts in 1981 as reliable and validated. Both are now understood to be fundamentally unreliable. Huffington was convicted on 2 counts of capital murder and sentenced to death. He spent approximately 10 years on death row before being transferred to the general prison population. The case against him was not reviewed seriously for decades. Then Justice Department documents surfaced establishing that the specific FBI agent who had testified in the case had a history of fabricating evidence. The hair comparison testimony was re-examined under new scientific standards that had emerged from years of DNA exoneration work. Those standards concluded that the 99.9% match claims made by hair comparison analysts had no legitimate scientific basis. CBLA was independently debunked by the 2004 NAS report. Every piece of physical evidence that had placed Huffington at the scene was gone. When his legal team requested DNA testing on the biological material from the 1981 crime scene, the state sought to have it destroyed. The attempt failed. Testing confirmed the hair was not Huffington's. The 99.9% match had been a fabrication. He was exonerated, released, and granted a full pardon in 2023, 42 years after the crime. He is currently pursuing a $100 million civil lawsuit against the county for the conviction that resulted from fabricated federal forensic testimony. The state's attempt to destroy the evidence before it could be tested was not an administrative oversight. It was an effort to prevent the test from happening. Whatever the legal reasoning offered in support of that motion, its effect would have been to keep an innocent man in prison by eliminating the one piece of physical evidence that could prove what the FBI's science had concealed for 4 decades. The motion failed, and the test was conducted, and it said what it said. John Huffington was 18 years old in 1981. He was in his mid-60s when the pardon arrived. Case number 8, Kenneth Caguñera. Investigators told Kenneth Caguñera that if he went to trial, the FBI's bullet lead analysis would prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he had been present at the scene of Walter Bowman's murder. They called the technique reliable. They called it powerful. They told him a jury would hear it and convict him, and that the conviction could carry the death penalty. Caguñera had no physical connection to the crime. He had not been there. But he had no way to challenge what the FBI was offering, and a death sentence was being held in front of him as the consequence of finding out. In 2000, he took an Alford plea, a legal mechanism through which a defendant pleads guilty while maintaining factual innocence, and was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison for a murder he did not commit. Kenneth Caguñera lived in Buncombe County, North Carolina. When Walter Bowman was shot and killed during a home invasion in 2000, police conducted an aggressive investigation that swept up multiple individuals in its net. The actual perpetrators had left bandanas at the scene. Their DNA was on those bandanas. That DNA was in the state database. The connection between the physical evidence left at the crime scene and the men who had actually committed the murder was available to investigators from the beginning. That connection was not made. Instead, Caguñera was brought in and presented with a choice engineered by the threat of a forensic technique that had no valid scientific foundation. Walter Bowman was killed in his own home in Buncombe County. A robbery had been planned. He was shot. The men who did it left physical evidence behind and fled. His death deserved a real investigation, one that followed the evidence that existed rather than building a case around a threat deployed against an innocent man. The investigators who confronted Caguñera did not present CBLA, results from his specific case, as courtroom evidence. They wielded the technique as a promise. Submit this evidence, they told him, and it will prove you were there. That use of CBLA as a pre-trial coercive instrument rather than as evidence represents one of the more troubling applications of junk science in the entire history of the technique. No test was conducted linking Caguñera to the scene. The threat of the test was sufficient. Under the Alford plea, he entered a formal guilty plea to second-degree murder while maintaining his factual innocence, avoiding the death penalty by surrendering his right to contest a charge he had every reason to fight. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years. He served years in prison before post-conviction review brought DNA technology to the physical evidence that had been sitting in the case record since 2000. The bandanas recovered from the scene were tested. The profiles matched men who were already in the North Carolina State DNA database, men whose genetic material had been collected in connection with other offenses, whose identities had been available to investigators from the beginning. The people who had actually killed Walter Bowman were identifiable before Cogonera ever took his plea. The system had simply failed to look. Kenneth Cogonera was fully exonerated and pardoned in 2015, approximately 15 years after Bowman's death. He was not the only man wrongly implicated in connection with this case. Multiple individuals in Buncombe County were swept into the investigation and faced similar coercive pressures. The case illustrated something that extends beyond the courtroom applications of forensic fraud. That junk science can be weaponized before a trial begins, used to eliminate a person's willingness to exercise their right to contest the charges against them. The real killer's DNA had been in the state database the entire time. The evidence that could have cleared Cogonera and identified the actual perpetrators required only that someone look for it. No one did until it was almost too late.